You ready to go, Rick? So
I am.
I want to welcome everybody. I've got to keep an eye on the admitting waiting room. There we go. A couple more people I'm sure will be coming. But on behalf of the Friends of the Crawford House and the Tinton Falls Historic Preservation Commission, thanks for joining us on a rainy Sunday afternoon. My name is Stacy Slowinski, and I'll be hosting the event today with my colleague Mike Lee and our guest Rick Geffken. Mike will be helping me to monitor the chat. If you have any questions or comments as we go along, please put them in the chat, and then Mike will bring them to Rick's attention as we go along. Our guest today is Rick Geffken, and I suspect he's familiar to many of you, but by way of introduction, just in case he's not, Rick is a retired U.S. Army officer and a Vietnam veteran, and thank you for your service. He's also retired from a career as a sales executive at Hewlett-Packard. He's certainly not been idle since he left the corporate world. He has written numerous articles on Monmouth County history for a variety of local newspapers, magazines, historical societies, and newsletters. And he has appeared on the New Jersey cable TV show Family Historian. He's the author of 5 books to date, including, of course, the subject of today's presentation, Stories of Slavery in New Jersey. He has spoken about Monmouth County historical topics at dozens of historical societies and has been our guest at the Crawford House 3 times so far. We're excited to have Rick join us again today and to share his recent work on slavery in New Jersey, especially since slavery was such a large part of the early history of Tinton Falls. His research is always fascinating and his presentation's dynamic. So without further ado, I think I'll hand it over to Rick.
Thank you, Stacy, and good afternoon, everybody, on a little spring kind of rainy day. I'm going to ask Stacy to let me know when you can see my full screen here in 1 second. Is that popped up for everyone?
Yep, that has.
Perfect.
So thanks for everybody for coming this afternoon. And, you know, spring is almost here, so I'm sure we're all anxious for that. And a lot of other good news, I hope. So as you can see, that's the cover of the book. And I hope you know, but you will soon, that New Jersey was the, embarrassingly enough, the last northern state to abolish slavery. So we're going to talk about some of the stories that I wrote about here. And just to give you an idea, I didn't know anything, frankly, about slavery in New Jersey. And I went to schools throughout, including my master's degree at Montclair State. And in that whole time in my education, no one ever mentioned slavery in New Jersey to my knowledge. So this was new to me. And my friend Don Burton, who's on, and I wrote the book about the story of Shrewsbury Revisited several years ago. And I started to come across references to slavery in Monmouth County originally, and developed a number of facts and figures about it. And then I expanded it. And here we go with this book. So I was happy to include, there's 12 pages of bibliography. And so what I intended to do with this book, I hope it comes across that way, is to make it very readable. It's not an academic text. It's not heavily footnoted. But if you would go and look at the bibliography, should you get it, and please look up the other scholars, black and white, who have written about this topic long before I was around. So that's the preface for you. So I'm going to put myself here on in an effort to stop being a talking head. I'll just put a little pretty picture of me there. So here we go. I'll bet everybody on this call remembers seeing this probably from kindergarten, 1st grade on, this iconic yet apocryphal picture of George Washington and the men crossing the Delaware in December of 1776 at a place called McConkey's Ferry. And they're heading to the left side of the picture, the painting, which is New Jersey, and they're going to go down that evening and confront the British in Trenton. And it's a wonderful picture, but it's not real because the painter did it 75 years after the actual event, so he couldn't have known. Nonetheless, it's really patriotic. And as we know, these guys, and they were mostly guys, were fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the premise of my book and today's little talk is that's great, but we have to ask ourselves, whose life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness were they interested in? And the answer is white landowners. As you know, in colonial America, that's who had the power, not only in the military, but in the, in the governments throughout the state. And they didn't care very much about anybody else when it came to that very high sounding tribute. But if you look real carefully in this painting, I think the painter knew something. Indeed, that's a black man. And the painter might have known and might have been referring to a real person who was with George Washington. And here's another image of this man in the back tending to George's horse. And he was William Billy Lee. And William Billy Lee was George Washington's slave, as startling as that sounds. And he was with him throughout the Revolutionary War and beyond into retirement. And he did what you can see in this image. He set up his tent every night during the Revolutionary War, tended to his horses, made his meals, ferried messages back and forth. Whatever George Washington wanted, Billy Lee did. And he was a slave, as we see, that George bought before the war. Ironically, in this French image, George is holding the Declaration of Independence, which talks all of this great talk, and yet here's his slave. To give you an idea what 61 colonial pounds might have meant around that time, you could buy for that amount of money 8 horses or 13 cows, or if you were a really skilled blacksmith or a shipwright maybe, or somebody else, you could spend the better part of 2 years trying to earn that kind of money. And I use those analogies on purpose to show you that people who owned slaves in our early history really did think of them as property and not as a fully enhanced human being. Lee, as I mentioned, was with George all through the Revolutionary War period, most of which battles were fought, as I hope you know, in New Jersey, sometimes called the cockpit of the Revolution for that reason. And Billy Lee, at the end of the war, when the Patriot side, if you will, won, was all set to retire down to Mount Vernon with George back to his estate. And Billy Lee had met a woman named Margaret Thomas, a black woman, and he wanted to marry her and bring her with him. And approached his, you'd have to say, friend at this point, right? And asked if he had permission. And George Washington, after all of that time, hesitated to give this man permission to bring his wife in. And it showed you kind of the feeling that white slaveholders, no matter how intimate they might be with individual slaves, felt about these people. Now, it turns out that people of Mount Vernon say that they have no record of Margaret Thomas ever showing up there, so she may have died in the interim, although Billy Lee spent the rest of his life down in Mount Vernon with George Washington. He was quite famous for what he had done during the war with him. In another painting, which is very apocryphal, you have a very nice image here, bucolic image of slaves, well refreshed and obviously fed well in the fields of Mount Vernon under the beneficial eye of George Washington, and probably very far from the reality. Which is not to say that George Washington might not have treated individual slaves kindly at one point or another, but the vast majority were, as the name indicates, slaves and had no control over how they were treated. As a matter of fact, I hope you know there were a lot of slaves in Mount Vernon when George died. There were over 300. This was post-presidency, of course. And yet, through all of that, when he died and in his last will and testament, he only freed one, Billy Lee. Kind of amazing. The truth is that he could not have freed the rest even if he had wanted to, because they didn't belong to him. And the story there is that Martha Washington, in this image, was George was actually her second husband. Her first husband, Daniel Custis, had died. Martha inherited those slaves, and so they were called dower slaves. And when she brought them into the marriage with George, he did not have, under the law at the time, the ability to free them. But it looks, for all intents and purposes, that he had no intention of doing that anyway, since he only chose to free one of his own. In this image, by the way, you can still see Billy Lee in the background because he was always very closely associated with the Washington family, even in Mount Vernon. These two kids, by the way, are Martha's natural custis grandchildren who George adopted. This guy here, who called himself Washington Custis, wasn't his real name, became a slaveholder and actually fathered a couple of children by two different slave women. So the point there is that slaveholders in the early days of the country continued to abuse and neglect the people that they owned. Martha herself was who brought a huge number of slaves into the marriage. Also, in her last will, only saw fit to free one of those. So it's a kind of a sad testimony to these folks. This is a very early image, probably when she, much before she was married to George. But when you read that statement, it's really surprising. But that was apparently how Martha looked at Black people during her entire life. And the irony there to me is, why would you expect slaves to be grateful for anything? You know, you might have been kind to one or two, but my God, you're controlling their lives. But yet people of the time expected gentle, kind, and grateful behavior back from the people that they owned. And there is a famous story about one of her slaves, a woman named Ona, or Oni Judge, who, her young woman, was a seamstress from Martha Washington, and overheard one day a conversation with Martha and that indicated that she was likely to be sold. And she had always assumed, for one reason or another, that she would be freed upon Martha's death. So she did what any slave would do faced with that horrendous future. She ran away. George was still alive, and begins this awful tale of the next several decades, frankly, of the Washingtons hiring people to go find this woman to bring her back into enslavement. In fact, they take out a newspaper article, this one from the Philadelphia newspaper, describing her as best they could in order to have people return for $10 this woman. And finally, after some time, one of their agents did locate where Oni had been. And she said, listen, I'll come back, but I need a guarantee that I'm going to be freed at some point. And again, surprising, when having been pursued all these years, that word got back to George Washington. He refused to negotiate with the woman. And his reason was he didn't want to reward unfaithfulness. So what he was talking about was, my God, if I bring her back and then promise her freedom, other slaves are likely to run away and be rebellious, which of course he was right about. They certainly would have. But the father of our country, right, who fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is showing no mercy, frankly, to the people that he owned. The good news is that Ona never came back, married up in New Hampshire, and lived well into the 19th century as a free woman. But again, emblematic of how very famous people thought about slavery in the early days. Another very famous guy associated with New Jersey, although you may not recognize him from this picture, is this guy who we all think of as this benevolent Quaker, lovely to the Indians, city of brotherly love founder, all that kind of stuff. True as far as it goes, except he was also a slave master. And his involvement with slavery has a lot to do with Tinton Falls, for that matter. Turns out that you know this part of him. I don't know if you know that at one point with a syndicate of other men, he owned the entirety of what would become New Jersey, both East and then West Jersey, as they were called then. He bought them. But he was a businessman and a Quaker. And after he had founded the colony over on the other side of the Delaware, he went back to London. And then comes into play Tinton Falls. Because the original owner of the vast estate of Tinton Falls, Tinton Manor, it was called back then, was a guy named Lewis Morris, who had come up, as I think a lot of you know now, from Barbados with 60 or so slaves from his sugar plantation, took over this former iron mill, and all around where the Crawford House is, and certainly where Stacy lives, set up this huge estate and had his slaves run the entirety of the agricultural pursuits. On his last will and testament, he has a phrase in there which I read, that he says he will bequeath his, he called him his personal servant, but it was a slave Yaf, to William Penn. And the backstory there is that William Penn was back in London in those days, and Lewis Morris, who knew him, wanted him to come back. You know, they wanted to hang out together, like-minded upper crust. And so he says, you can have my personal servant Yaf. And in fact, when Lewis Morris dies, it takes several years, but by 1699, William Penn does return. And Lewis Morris, the nephew, same name nephew of the original, presents Yaf to William Penn, who takes him to Philadelphia for a couple of years. And in fact, he's involved in William Penn's construction of his country estate up the river. You may have been to a place called Penn Manor up in the Delaware. And I'm happy to tell you that Stacy and Kathy and I are involved in doing some kind of commemorative to Yaf, who spent, we know, at least 20 years in Tinton Falls with first Lewis Morris before he was given to William Penn. We have a letter from William Penn in 1703 when he was back in London. He spent about 3 or 4 years back in the colonies, goes back to London, and he writes back to his secretary in Philadelphia saying, listen, Yaf's over here with me in a little town called Deal, for which our Deal in Loudoun County is named, and I'm going to free him. And this past April, literally, I was all set to go over to stay with some friends in England and go down to Deal and see if I could come up with any idea of what happened to Yaf, because he was a very accomplished guy. He spoke several languages, knew an awful lot about early colonial America, obviously. And even in the letter, William Penn says he's a good husbandman, meaning he's good with animals and a planter. So the guy had skills, and I think he probably would have stayed in England when he was manumitted rather than to come back where he had been enslaved. Unless, of course, he got a wife and kids back here. Now, we have no documentation of that, so maybe in the future I'll be lucky and I'll get over there and kind of run down what might have happened to the man. He was probably in his mid to late 50s by the time he was freed, so there's a good chance that he lived longer and stayed in England. As I mentioned, he stayed over there, and we don't know quite yet what happened to him. But I need to back up and tell you, although those are, you know, kind of upper crust famous people, where did slavery begin in New Jersey? And it began with these people who, as you can tell, are Dutch, because in the early days, as you know, the Dutch owned New York and what became New Jersey as well. They called this vast expanse of land the New Netherlands. Downtown New York, they called it New Amsterdam. And in order for them to expand, because they originally were traders, what they wanted to do was now expand into the other side of the river, into what is now New Jersey. They offered these Dutch patroons, think of the word patron, these kind of middle-class managers, big swaths, 12-mile-long swaths of land across the river from New Netherlands to Amsterdam, and in order to encourage them to develop it up in what was then Bergen County, New Jersey. So to give you an idea what that looked like then, right here on the right side of the map is Lower Manhattan, the Battery. They called this at the time the North River. We call it the Hudson River. The Delaware was the South River back then. And this neck of land here, where they established the first colony, Bergen, was about 3 blocks from where I went to college at St. Peter's in Jersey City. And this Bergen Neck, so-called, was now Jersey City and Bayonne. And in order to help these colonists, these patroons, develop this land, the Dutch West India Company sold them slaves that they were getting from Africa, through South America and the Caribbean, and then up to New York, what became New York in any event. So slavery gets a foothold in then Bergen County, now Hudson County, very early in the 17th century. And it didn't take long, as you know, for the English to come in, and in 1664, they take over. And then these guys do even more damage. And you know them from their reputation. That's Berkeley and Carteret. And when the English take over New York and New Jersey, they issue a document that is considered one of the founding documents of our state, called the Concession and Agreement of the Lords Proprietors. And in order to have English colonists come over here, with Berkeley and Carteret, and they split, by the way, East and West Jersey, what they put into this concession agreement was you get 150 acres for every white person you bring over. Every white servant you bring over, you get another 150 acres, and 75 additional acres for every slave that you bring into the colony. So in fact, it baked into our founding document was slavery. So, you know, by the later part of the 17th century, slavery is firmly established in New Jersey. Now, what Berkeley and Carteret are doing is they're responding to their patron, the Duke of York, later to become James II of England. They had taken the Stuart king side during the civil wars in England, and the Stuarts won. Charles is king. His brother James gets this vast territory in the New World, basically up here in North America. And he, in turn, the Duke of York, gives it to Berkeley and Carteret, and then they sell it. They were land speculators, basically. But what they're doing about the slaves is this, because we have to keep in mind, these people are business people. Okay, they're not interested in starting a new country. They're interested in making money. And so a few years before the English took over, the Duke of York, James, established and was the principal stockholder in a company called the Royal African Company, whose entire charter was to take English ships down to Africa, trade in precious metals, goods, and people, and bring them into first South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and then later the original 13 colonies. So these two guys who were his friends are deeply entrenched in this business arrangement. And you can even see here in the original Royal African Company corporate seal, you can see a couple of African men and an elephant. That company lasted for 80 years. And during its lifetime of a company, they started bringing slaves directly into our first slave entrepot, which was Perth Amboy, New Jersey. As I mentioned, a lot of these people, like Lewis Morris, start on the way to their fortunes in the Caribbean. In fact, here's an image from Barbados, and these two Quakers, he's holding tobacco leaves there, because the original Barbadian economy, when the English took over, was on tobacco, and it shifted pretty quickly to sugarcane, which became fabulously, and they all became fabulously wealthy, as sugar was a very rare commodity in those days. You can see slaves in the background of this image. And Lewis Morris, as I mentioned, and as you know, was only one of the planters, but he comes up specifically to Tinton Falls. It's a later picture, obviously, because it had the second largest waterfall south of the Great Falls in Patterson. And Lewis Morris needed that water power to turn wheels in his mills, so his slaves, 60 of which he brought up with him from Barbados, could grind corn and wheat and barley and everything else he was growing, so he could ship it up to New York. So we have to keep in mind that slavery was about finance and a way for white slaveholders to make money real quickly as best they could. And they made fabulous amounts of money in the early days.
Before we go any further, I got a couple questions, statements that I might want to just read now, if that's okay with you, Rick.
Go ahead.
So one said from earlier with George Washington, said that I had read that when George Washington was in Philadelphia White House at the time, he would rotate his slaves between there and Mount Vernon every 6 months to avoid the slaves being freed under Pennsylvania law. Have you heard that?
I don't know that, but it sounds logical. I'm trying to highlight George's involvement in New Jersey, but that sounds like something he might do. There's some indication, by the way, that George, primarily because he knew Billy Lee so well, started to think a little bit differently toward the end of his life about the institution of slavery. Nonetheless, he only saw fit to free one man. So that's, he wasn't convinced that they were full human beings.
And then also, would you happen to know if the land in Connecticut was also allocated by the number of slaves?
I do not know that, but that's probably a fairly easy search on Google. But whoever asked that question, if you send me an email, I know some folks that have studied and are concurrently studying Connecticut slavery, and I'll certainly put you in touch with them. So that's a really good question.
And one last one. I thought that Quakers were big on the abolitionist movement and with the Underground Railroad. I guess they also just naturally changed, went from.
So that's a great question, and everybody says that, and that's why I purposely put it in. Early Quakers were, by and large, especially the Quakers that came into Monmouth County from, frankly, Brooklyn originally, were just business people, and a lot of them were slaveholders. And Quakers were always on the forefront of abolition, but it was later, much later in the 18th century, that they started to rally around that idea. And you all know, very close to us in Shrewsbury, the Shrewsbury meeting was very, very much in the forefront of abolishing slavery. But that took a long time. Early Quakers, including, and I know a lot of you know where the Parker homestead is in Little Silver. I've got records of some of the Parkers, Quakers, almost the entire family who lived in that house, also owned slaves. So it took a while, like it did everybody, you'll see here in this presentation, to come to grips with the awful institution of slavery. But terrific question. Okay. If I can, just to show you, after slavery in the 17th century is starting to get its foothold in New Jersey, within a couple of years, it's everywhere. So here's a very early census record. You can see 1737. Look here on the left, we don't even have 21 counties yet. And the white population is about 43,500 people in New Jersey by that year. The slave population, by the way, Negroes and other slaves, and those would of course be Native American Lenapes and whoever else they could get hold of. That 4,000 almost figure represents about 8% of the entire population. So slavery is growing by leaps and bounds, and it's making the white slaveholders really, really nervous for a really good reason. So on the surface, it sounds like a good idea, right? Wow, by natural propagation, slave women are having babies. I'm getting free slaves. Oh, by the way, I'm helping that along, as I think you know. And it would look on the surface to be a good deal, but it's not a good deal because slaves are always running away. They're rebellious, as well they should have been. And it's making the white slaveholders really nervous about what's going to happen. And so how they respond to that is with an increasingly harsh series of laws that we're going to get into in a second. Oh, by the way, that's a kind of a crucial year because a couple of years later in New York City, there's a huge outbreak of the slave rebellion. Slaves had plotted to slash the throats of their masters, and they were going to burn down New York City. And of course, they didn't. They got started, and it was brutally suppressed. They were hanged, quartered, burns at the stake, and all the usual horrendous remedies that people took against rebellious slaves. Historically, in New Jersey, by about 1800, we got to roughly 10% of the population. But slaveholders were always looking over their shoulder, wondering what was going to happen, as well they should. So to give you an idea how quickly this takes off, it didn't take very long throughout everywhere in New Jersey for slaveholders to understand that they could make their fortunes with slaves. And a lot of this is, believe it or not, associated with William Penn. One of his Quaker friends in Philadelphia is a slaveholder named William Trent, who's making his fortune, among other ways, by trading in the Caribbean in goods and people. And he decides after he makes a lot of money, he's going to have a country estate over on the eastern side of the Delaware River at a place then called the Falls of the Delaware. And he builds this house right here in 1719 and it's his country estate, and he brings slaves over. And the slaves he brings take over some mills that he bought, and they're working their butts off to, make more money for this guy. This is one on Crosswoods Creek in that part of our state. And then enters this guy, and some of you will recognize that picture. That is Lewis Morris, the nephew from Tinton Falls, who in 1738 gets appointed as the first royal colonial governor of New Jersey. And he decides after a while that he's going to move his budding government over to what was then called Trentstown, which of course is Trenton. But he's got a problem, and his problem is his wife Isabel says, yeah, that's great, I'll go over there with you, but we're bringing some slaves because I'm not doing any of the heavy lifting. And oh, by the way, the slaves are not going to live with us, are they? So what does he do? This guy, Lewis Morris, writes to the then owner of that house, because William Trent is long since dead. Governor Thomas of Pennsylvania owned the house at that point. And in the letter that we have, Lewis Morris says, listen, I want to come over there and rent that house that you showed me, but I got to have you build a kitchen out back to lodge my servants. Well, he's talking about his slaves. And the reason for that is Isabella doesn't want slaves in the house living with her, clearly, because that's not what she has back in Tinton Falls. And secondly, in colonial days, you'd build kitchens as outbuildings for fear of fire. So that's what Governor Thomas does, and he rents the house to the Morrises, and they come over. And for the next 4 years until Lewis Morris dies, that's where New Jersey's original government begins. And that house is still there. It's now called the Trent House Museum. I've been there, spoken there a few times. And post-pandemic, I'm sure you can get there. And they do a very good job, by the way, of acknowledging that slaves had lived there. But it's going to get a little bit more interesting over the next few years, I think, because a person that I know you know well in Tinton Falls, Rich Veit from Monmouth University, has been conducting excavations out there for the last few years. And when I went over a couple of summers ago, they're looking for buildings that are gone, one of which is that kitchen. Now, I don't know if this picture I took is actually the kitchen foundation, but if it is, or if they ever do find it, it would be really interesting to see if any of those slaves left any artifacts, cultural or religious articles that they may have left behind, might help us identify their culture, where they were from. It's a little late in the game by the 1740s for any of them to having come up from Barbados, 60, 80 years ahead of that, but maybe, but they may have still been practicing their religious beliefs, and we might find evidence of a slave that lived there someday. So that's Trenton. Up the road a piece in what was then West Jersey, slavery is also in Princeton, because a friend of William Penn's buys a huge amount of acreage from Penn, brings his slaves over to develop this huge piece of land, mostly agriculturally. And here is Princeton. I'm sure everybody here has been there one time. There's Nassau Street. Okay. Richard Stockton's son, John Stockton, is the guy that is one of the founders of Princeton University. And his son, named after his father, Richard Stockton, that guy, is the guy that builds Morven. And Morven is this famous, just down the road a piece, plantation house for the Stockton family. They do an excellent job these days, by the way, of acknowledging the many, many slaves that worked at Morven, which I think you also know was our colonial governor's mansion at one point in our history as well. But here's where it gets really, really interesting around the time of the Revolutionary War. This Richard Stockton and about 38 other guys who signed the Declaration of Independence are slaveholders. And they see at the time no contradiction in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, and at the same time owning slaves. Well, it turns out that after that, Stockton fights against the British. He gets captured during the war, dies in a British prison camp in New York in 1781, and his slaves then revert to his wife, this one, Anna Boudneau, who was a poetess and fairly famous in her own right. She is, of course, in Morven with all the slaves now. She's the mistress of them. And then she does something really, really startling. I'm going to let you read it. So what happened was that one of her slave women died in childbirth. And Anna Stockton still had young children. So she wet nursed this slave, Marcus Marsh, who stayed with her for years and years and years as he grew up, and she later freed him. So built into this incredible oppressive institution of slavery, we have these contradictions. We've got a guy and many men who owned slaves, and yet we have, and didn't think of them as fully formed human beings. And then you have some people, and she wasn't the only one, who do these incredibly kind human things for these people. And you know, our history, not in New Jersey, but everywhere, is replete with these kinds of stories of, you know, you're treating people brutally, but at the same time, you at least sort of acknowledge that they're not just chattel property, that they're human beings. So there's an incredible number of stories like this. So those are kind of the rich and famous in New Jersey. And it doesn't take too long, as you would suspect, for people like us, I guess, middle-class folks who embrace slavery as well. And these two men in our history play a notorious role in New Jersey history. And on the left is Charles Morgan, who's actually from Middlesex County. Morgan, New Jersey, that I bet a lot of you know, not too far from here, is named after his family. That's his brother-in-law, who's a judge, Jacob Van Wickle. And of course, maybe not of course, and it didn't come up the way I wanted it to, but that is a newspaper article showing that Captain James Morgan, who's Charles' father, whoops, hang on, we'll try this again. There they are. Stacy, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yep,
Okay.
looks good.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Internet. So anyway, during the Revolutionary War, James Morgan knows that he can make money from slavery, and he's advertising here to return a runaway slave. So the Morgan family knew a lot about slavery, and they also knew they could make money. And so what Charles and his brother-in-law up with is this scheme. Now, Charles had moved from New Jersey to a place called Point Coupee in Louisiana near Baton Rouge. He started his own plantation, which he immodestly called Morganza. And they recognize something that's happened because New Jersey is starting by the 19th century to recognize that we have to do something about slavery. And in 1804, we passed a law called the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Underline the word gradual. So what's happening is slaves are going to be freed over time. And so the way that we approach that is with some restrictions to how long they have to serve. And so in effect, slave owners realize that their property, these people in New Jersey, are going to be worth less money. At the same time, down south, which is cotton and tobacco and sugar and rice and all these other crops, need labor. So these two guys come up with this scheme. And what they do is they lure free, already manumitted former slaves, to Van Wickle's house. And they know the law. And they said, listen, there's great opportunity for you down south. We'll send you down there, and you could start your lives over again. You could get hired. You'll make a lot of money. And some of these folks that show up at this house to hear these lectures are women without husbands, with kids. Husbands are gone, one reason or another. And so because the judge knows the law, he has them sign these phony consent forms. And these forms basically say, because you can't really ship slaves in New Jersey out of state in those days without their permission, they're acknowledging, if they could even read, that they're signing that, oh yeah, okay, we'll agree to do this. And so Van Wickle and a couple of other people send down to Charles shiploads of free Black people under the guise of employment down there. And of course, it's phony. And what happens is when they get down there, and we know we have records of at least that many so-called free Negroes, they get to New Orleans and they get sold into slavery. And Morgan keeps a couple for his own plantation up the river, up the Mississippi. It's this horrendous thing that they do to these people. And today there is a project in Middlesex County, and I'm going to tell you that in a second. But this was well known, these men, these two and a couple of their associates, when the scheme is revealed, get indicted and never punished. They get away with the whole thing. It's just horrible, horrible thing. Today, we know a lot about this because there's this project I would urge you to look up online called Lost Souls Public Memorial Project. Some of the people in there are descendants of some of these Jersey Negroes who were shipped down and sold into slavery. As far as we know, none of them ever made it back to New Jersey. We don't even know, because it's early, it's 1818, if any of them lived, perhaps some of the children, into abolition times, after the Civil War. But some of the folks involved in this project, African Americans, have traced their DNA to some of those people and their descendants who still live in the Mississippi and Louisiana area. So it's just this horrible thing to indicate to you that people of color in those days, whether free or not, were just seen as commodities. So far, mostly I've talked about white people, and it's a whole nother obvious impact when you're black and subject to slavery than it is from the viewpoint of the slaveholder. So I want to talk about these two people who lived just down the road in Lincroft. And that there man, who's on the cover of my book, is Charles Reeves, born around 1820, enslaved in Middletown to a guy named David Williamson. And that house, Charlie, I like to hear this, is on Newman Springs Road in now Homedale, but it was then Middletown. And about 2 blocks from where my kids went to school. And I must have driven by that house a million times and had no idea it was associated with slavery. But that's where Charles served the first 2 decades of his life as a slave. Later on in his life, he meets another Middletown slave woman named Hannah Van Cleef. And you see in their names the reflection of historic slavery in New Jersey. Reeves is probably an English name, so someone of his ancestors perhaps was a Reeves, and the name came down that way. Hannah Van Cleef is clearly Dutch. That's a Dutch name. And so she may have been owned by a Dutch family. Now, it hasn't been documented yet, but at the Taylor Butler House on Kings Highway in Middletown, there was a woman named Elizabeth Van Cleef who was enslaved to the Taylors around that time. And it might be that she's related to them, although Van Cleef, there's a number of Dutch Van Cleefs. So when they meet, they marry, I'll tell you about that in a second, and they live in that house that you see behind her. And that's nothing but the most rudimentary of shacks that they don't even own because it's given them as part of a kind of a lend-lease agreement, while Charles, after he was manumitted, works for local farmers, a family named Crawford. A lot of you know the Crawford family, Crawford's Corners Road up in Homedale for that matter. And they raised 11 children in that house. They had a dirt floor, and it isn't much. And it's, they had a little subsistence garden in the back while Charles worked where he could to earn a living for his family once he was free. Hannah never worked outside the home because she was plenty busy with 11 kids. And this act that I mentioned before influenced their lives very greatly. Because once they were freed, and if we have their dates right, he would have been freed, Charles, around 1845. She would have been freed around 1850, because the act dictated that folks had to stay as slaves for a while. And we know that it had an influence on them because it turns out from their descendants that I have their marriage certificate. They were married in the Homedale Baptist Church. Homedale at one point was called Baptiston. In 1850, and their descendants and I believe that they waited till they were free from slavery to get married, and that's what happened. And they spent their entire life, as did the next 3 generations, in that house. Incredible, and became very well respected figures in Lincroft because that house was on Middletown Lincroft Road. I probably drove by there many times. And the house lasted from the 1850s up through and including about 1971. It's gone now. And they raised their family there. They were very well known in town, very well respected. They were in some early histories that talk about them in Lincroft. They were known famously, among other reasons, for walking every Sunday from Lincroft to Red Bank, where they went to the Baptist church. In fact, they were part of the original parish of what is now Pilgrim Baptist. Different location, but that congregation. Really, really well-respected people. Now, another law, actually a federal law, greatly influenced their lives. In 1850, the Southern Congress people pushed through in Washington, D.C., the fugitive slave law, because as you would suspect, slaves are always running away. And they're coming up north, what became known as the Underground Railroad, and they're trying to get up to Canada, wherever they can, to be free. And so this law gets passed, which says to anybody up north that you are liable and you must, by law, by federal law in 1850, return any of these runaway slaves. And by the way, if you shelter them or help them in any way, you're subject to jail time and monetary fines. And one of the other results of this horrible law is that slave catchers, whom you've seen in movies like 12 Years a Slave and Harriet and those kinds of things, are hired by these Southern planters to come up. And oh, by the way, any black people they can get their hands on, they're going to bring back to the South for rewards. And they don't particularly care if you're the actual runaway. If you're black and they can kidnap you, to them, the slave catchers, that's fair game. And how this influences Charles and Hannah's life and many, many other people is the following. Because a few months after that law is passed, we have a record that 14 black men, free black men, buy property, a 3-acre piece of property in Lincroft from James Crawford. We call that property today, it's right next to St. Leo's in Lincroft, the Cedar View Cemetery. And I'm on a committee to restore it and kind of document what went on there. And where I say that influences at least the Reeves and many other families is that Charles Reeves buys that plot number 12. These plots are, by the way, about 100 feet by 40. And I think he does that for a specific reason. He didn't own anything in 1850 when he got married. And in order to insulate himself from slave catchers, he buys a part of a cemetery plot, which gives him a deed so that if anybody accosts him, he can say, look, I'm a property owner. You know that slaves don't own property, especially if I'm a runaway, I wouldn't own property. So it's one thing that's going to help him and his family, stay as free as they possibly can up north. That is the Reeves family plot today. This was back in the fall when we did a little bit of a cleanup. That's Charles and Hannah's actual graves back in that section. They have more stones, by the way, in their particular plot number 12 here than any other family in that graveyard. And oh, by the way, there are what were called U.S. colored troops, Civil War African-American veterans are also buried in that cemetery. So it's a very famous early African-American cemetery in Monmouth County. So how do I know all this stuff? Because it's not something you're going to find in a book anywhere. Well, now you will. Because I got really lucky and I met this wonderful person. May Edwards, in the last year of her life, was in a rest home, frankly, in Shrewsbury. And I got to meet her through some friends, and I spent a long time with her before she passed a year ago, July. She's the great-granddaughter of Charles and Hannah. She was born in that house. As I mentioned, 4 generations of Reeves descendants lived in that house. It wasn't given to the Reeves family until Charles had died in 1900. It was finally deeded to his son by James Crawford. May Edwards, you should know, was a career surgical nurse at Riverview Hospital for 40 years. Wonderful person. She alerted me to something that I never knew. I had always assumed, white person that I am, that black people couldn't possibly know their ancestry back to slavery times because of all the disruptions in their family, selling and moving and this, that, and the other thing. And in fact, I'm wrong. May, among many other people, knew all of this history that I'm only giving a little taste of very well. She had researched it all her life. She, at one point, was the president of the New Jersey chapter of the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society in New Jersey, and really was at the forefront of doing a lot of very, very early research into ancestry of slaves in Monmouth County. Just a terrific person I was fortunate to know, and I dedicated this book actually to her and her family. The children are friends of mine, and they're just a really wonderful group of people. And the whole point of the story here is that people coming from slavery are much more resilient than you would expect. And, you know, there are all kinds of professional folks in that family since those days going forward. So it's a really, really nice tribute to just the fortitude of people that come from, you know, really poor circumstances. I want to talk to you on the west side of our state about some other remarkable former slaves. And it has to do with the family of Levin and Charity Still. They were actually born enslaved in Maryland, but moved up after 1804, after that Gradual Abolition Act, to New Jersey, sort of in pieces. Levin comes up, he's going to send for Charity, and he does, and some of the kids come up with him, and I'll tell you why the rest don't. But among their children as they grow up are very famous New Jersey citizens. James Still, for one, this guy. He becomes known as a doctor of the pines. He's a herbalist. White and black people in Burlington County visit him all the time. He's remarkably efficient as a doctor, although you wouldn't be surprised to know that the white medical establishment did not want to recognize him because he hadn't been classically trained. His brother William Still, as an adult, is considered one of the founders of the Underground Railroad. In fact, William Still did this book there. And there's a story in that book that talks about another of their siblings. And it turns out that when Levin was up here and he wanted to bring up Charity and their kids, little by little, at one point Charity comes up with some kids, she gets caught, gets sold back into slavery, tries again and leaves behind for temporarily a couple of her young boys, going to bring them up later, and they get kidnapped and sold into Southern slavery. And one of those boys is this guy as an adult, Peter Still. And it's the most remarkable story that I think I've ever read. Because what happens is Peter Still spends 40 years in Alabama and Kentucky, and he's constantly sold as a slave down south. And eventually he earns enough money on the side, because one of the slave masters allowed him to work when he had some free time, to buy his own freedom. And he works his way up to Philadelphia. He gets directed to the Underground Railroad headquarters in Philadelphia right before the Civil War, and goes in and he meets the guy in there, and he's sitting with him and he's telling him the story. And the guy that he's talking to at this headquarters in Philadelphia says, "Wait a minute, I think you're my brother," because he's talking to William Still. And Peter says, "Well, no, that can't be. It's impossible." And he's very skeptical because, of course, he doesn't trust anybody. He's been enslaved his entire life. And Peter Still convinces him eventually that, no, in fact, I am your brother. You know, all these things you're telling me, I can give you some little hints here and there to show you that I know what you're talking about. And he says to Peter Still, not only that, how'd you like to meet Mom? Because their mother is still alive. And so William Still takes his brother Peter to Burlington, New Jersey, where Charity is still living. Their father's dead. And they have this wonderful reunion. After 45 years, she hasn't seen this boy, now a man. But Peter Still doesn't stop there. What he does is he spends the next 4 years of his life lecturing throughout the northern states, raising money until he gets $4,000, and he goes back south, buys his wife Lavinia's and children's freedom, and brings her up north, and they settle in the western part of our state. So it's just this incredible, incredible story of what people will do to become free and, you know, full citizens of this country. And not to be outdone, by the way, there's a great book about him too, just like his brother's books, that I recommend you read, called The Kidnapped and the Ransom. Just hair-raising stuff, and just inspirational as well. So kind of winding up here in a couple of minutes, you know a lot, I hope, about runaway slaves, and you should. Slaves were running away all the time. During the Revolutionary War, a famous slave in Shrewsbury named Titus, actually, he was owned by a guy named John Corliss down on the Rumson Peninsula, but it was then part of Shrewsbury. He runs away to go fight with the British because the British had promised runaway slaves that if they fought for them to help them put down this kind of little rebellion, they'd free them at the end of it. Well, it didn't work out that great for the British, and it really didn't work out that great for the thousands, literally thousands of slaves that ran away in the colonies, including hundreds in New Jersey, to fight for the British. Because at the end of the war, George Washington wanted those runaway slaves back. Basically, he was saying, look, we won the war. That's our property. Give us the slaves back. Luckily enough for some of them, the negotiations wound up where the British shipped out of New York over 3,000 black runaways up to Nova Scotia, where they started their lives over again as free people. But of course, New Jersey became famous, as did many other states, for what became the Underground Railroad. And as you can see from the south, points south, runaways would come up the western part of our state, paralleling kind of Delaware, stay at all these little safe houses, of which there are memorials and museums all over our state down there. They would cut across the thinnest part of New Jersey, trying to get to Staten Island or even through Jersey City to New York, where they could get up to Canada and free. And this brings in the story of the most famous Underground Railroad conductor of all, who you all know very well. But you might not know that that's not her real name, because the woman was born Araminta Russ. And over her lifetime, she took her mother's first name, Harriet, and married a guy named Tubman when she was enslaved. And so we know her by that name, of course. Incredibly brave person, born in 1820 in Maryland. She escapes before she's 30 years old, gets to Philadelphia and starts to work with William Still that we talked about, and then decides, rather than just enjoy her own freedom, she's going to go back and help people. And originally she goes back to try to get her husband free. And as you probably know, if you saw the movie at least, she finds out when she gets back to Maryland that he's already remarried because she was gone. So she frees her parents, and then she goes back and forth for almost 24 times, bringing other slaves north through the Underground Railroad, and is very successful. Best records say maybe around 75 or so folks is who she freed. After the war, she retires up to a place called Auburn, New York, gets married again, opens up, by the way, because she never stopped, an old home, an aged home for former slaves, so they had a place to live. She has to petition our government because she had worked as a spy during the Civil War for her pension, which she eventually gets. She's involved in the women's right to vote movement very early on. Just this incredible person who died, before certainly the women's right to vote ever came about, but never stopped in her lifetime. And if we're lucky, and I think we will be very shortly, as you know, this had been postponed for the last 5 years for maybe some pretty obvious reasons, but maybe we'll see this, at the very least, small tribute to this wonderful woman on one of our national currencies. So how did we, now that you know some of these dirty little stories, how did we as a state approach abolition? And here's my answer to that. It took us in New Jersey a good 200 years to come to grips with this horrible institution. And we did it through a series of laws, piecemeal, and a lot of agony and a lot of obvious death to a lot of slaves and former slaves. You might remember that I talked about these increasingly harsh laws. And very early in our state history, we passed this law. And this law is horrible to read. And if you ever want to, really feel disgusted, go online and look this up. And you'll see that slaves are forbidden to read and write, of course, because if they learn how to read and find out the Bible says all men are created equal, among other things, what do we have then? Slaves have to have a pass if they go off their master's property on an errand, let's say. And if they don't have a pass and get caught off their owner's property, they can be beaten and whipped by any white person who wants to, including killed, and no penalty for that person. But more often than not, they'd be brought back for a reward. And there's just these horrible, horrible ways that they're regulated, mostly out of fear, well-founded fear, by the way, that the slaves would rebel and kill their masters. One of the really horrible parts in this law is it says, because New Jersey's sort of kind of realizing this may not be the best moral route to take with slavery, it says, however, that if you want to, any of you out there who want to free your slaves, you've got to provide the government with 200 colonial pounds and 20 pounds every year that person lives after you free them. That's $38,000 in today's money, or $3,800 a year. And it's put in there purposely because nobody is going to do that. It wants to actually prevent people from freeing slaves. And you do it by putting this harsh monetary penalty on them if they do. And nobody's going to do it. And secondly, the facetious part of it is that you're requiring upkeep, basically, for every year the free person lives, as if slaves couldn't support themselves. And the irony of that is, of course, slaves could support themselves. They were blacksmiths and shipwrights and everything else that white people had to do, and they had skills, and they could certainly have supported themselves. But the paternalism built into slavery wasn't going to allow that possibility. And the law is terribly unpopular, no matter its harshness, and is finally repealed. I'm just going to give you a few others. There's a lot of laws about slavery in New Jersey. You know about this one already a little bit, but it basically says that children born to women after that day in 1804, if you're a male, you have to serve as a slave for 25 years. If you're a girl, for 21. So basically, you're relegating people for probably a good third of their lives to continue to be slaves. That's the gradual part. That's the awful part of this. In one of our early constitutions in 1844, we come out with some very high-minded lingo, kind of echoing the Declaration of Independence. We say in our Constitution, all men are free and independent. And this upsets people that have been slaveholders or are still slaveholders or depend upon slaves for labor. And so they take this to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court a year later says, oh, wait a minute, that's not really what we meant. We meant only white men. We certainly don't mean black people, and we certainly don't mean women. A couple years later, New Jersey says, oh, wait a minute, we got it right now. We're going to really abolish slavery, and we really, really mean it this time. Except we really, really don't mean it, because all we do is we change the title. We say current slaves have to be apprentices now. So it obviously doesn't matter to a black person what you call them if you're dictating how they eat, breathe, and live their lives. And we see these, by the way, this last law reflected in the census records, because from 1850 on, you see a very gradual, actually pretty steep reduction in the number of slaves in New Jersey. So that by the 1860 pre-Civil War federal census, we only list 18 slaves in New Jersey. But it's actually not true, because we've just called them apprentices, so they don't have to show up in the slave column. So there's a lot more slaves than 18 at the outbreak of the Civil War in New Jersey. Which brings us to how we finally did get rid of slavery here. Okay. You may not have known that again, embarrassingly, we were the only northern state who didn't vote for Abraham Lincoln. We certainly didn't do it the first time he ran, and the second time he ran, he was being opposed by a local favorite son, if you will, who was from New Jersey, General McClellan. And so all our electoral college votes in both those years did not go to Abraham Lincoln. You know what happens, right? Lincoln gets inaugurated. That really precipitates, because people knew that he was struggling with the institution of slavery. The South secedes through South Carolina first, Civil War begins, and then you have this horrendous 5-year period in our country, during which Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which only, by the way, emancipates the slaves in the states of rebellion. Now, no matter what Lincoln may have intended, and he was a politician, and if you know a little bit about him, he was betwixt and between about slavery. Although he didn't necessarily like it, he was looking for solutions. And what he does here is he only frees the slaves in the states of rebellion because he could not, by law, free the slaves in the North. By law, these are people's property, and he didn't have the right, the federal government didn't have the right to take people's property away from them. There's also, Lincoln did consider a movement to what was basically thought of as repatriating blacks to Africa or South America. He thought that might be a solution. And the crazy part about that is by the mid-19th century, very few of the slaves remaining were Africans. They were Americans. Why would they want to go back to Africa that they knew nothing about? So what happens? Lincoln gets assassinated in April of '65. The war's over soon thereafter, and the 13th Amendment gets passed by, or ratified rather, by 27, which represents 75% of the existing states, and it abolishes slavery nationally forever. Whoop, sorry. Except that, let me get caught up here again, except that, as you already know, New Jersey was the last. We didn't want to go along. And when it became a fait accompli in December of '65, the next month our legislature says, okay, fine, we'll do it. So we're the last of the northern states to go along with this. Another 150 years goes by before our legislature at the state level finally acknowledges, you can read the entire document online, and apologizes for what we did. But if you read it, there's a really big gaping hole in it, because there's nothing in that statement that talks about reparations. And so you know, right, that reparations is repair. And it seems to me that for the 200 years that we as a state, although none of us alive today, of course, engaged in this horrible practice, that we owe the descendants of people something. And I'm sure we'll see that debate in the next several decades. Maybe we'll see what happened in places like Georgetown University in Washington, or even the Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, where they're awarding the descendants of slaves scholarships to their schools. But I think also we probably have to consider monetary reparations for people that have been denied so long for what they did. And what they did was they helped build this country. This is not African American history. This is American history. The folks that we enslaved, I don't think it's any mystery to say that we wouldn't be the country we are today without the slave labor that we forced to make people do what we wanted. So we'll see how that debate plays out. So at that point, I will allow Stacy or Mike or whomever to talk about how folks can get a signed copy of my book through the Tin Falls Historical Society.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. Stace, do you want to mention on that? So we're going to definitely have it available on our website and social media once we get it all together.
Yep, I'll put my email in the chat, and if you're interested in a copy, I think the simplest thing is email me, and we can make a connection.
But Rick, we have a bunch of questions for you that I'm going to kind of go through, and bear with me. First one, I'm just going to go with what you were just talking about. When these slaves were freed, were they often employed by their owners afterwards?
So, that's a great question. It depends on, a couple of things. One of the really interesting things that I found was, people over the last 100 years or so say, well, look, slaves stayed with their owners. They must have liked it. No, they didn't like it. Where are they going to go? So literally Charles Reeves, that I talked about before, he walked down, I don't know what it was called then, but he walked down Newman Springs Road when he was freed and worked for another farmer. So they didn't have anything. So in some cases, slaves just stayed where they were. And they were, in effect, slaves still, but they just were not called that anymore. And sometimes, not just in New Jersey, but everywhere, especially down south, as you know, too, they just stayed where they were, lived the same way, weren't paid. And former slaveholders would say, well, look, I'm letting you work here, and you're getting meals and you have a place to live. What else do you want? But it's going to vary. If you were being treated particularly miserably and had been beaten and your kids sold away, maybe what you wanted to do is get away from that particular place as fast and as far as you could. But where are you going to go, and how are you going to do it? One day you're a slave, you don't own anything. It's not like you get on a bus and go somewhere else. That took a lot of years for people to come to grips with that. So, long answer to a question, but basically, they didn't go very far. They stayed within their geography as close as they could.
So when they were considered apprentice at that point, were their children freed? I think that's the question.
So good question. So by 1804, if a woman who was enslaved had children, as you already saw, they had to serve for a certain amount of time before they were freed. Now, that's one piece of it. And by the way, every county courthouse in New Jersey, and I've seen a lot of them, still have those black birth records, they call them, and black manumission records. We are in Monmouth County very unique and lucky. All of those are at the county clerk's archive site online. You could look up slaveholders' names or slave names throughout. But to the apprentice 1846 law, to that point, if they were apprentice, their children were free by birth. Others were not. The earlier ones were not. But then again, we're assuming that everybody's following the law to the letter, and of course, people don't do that. So we also know that some of the manumission records, although by law slaveholders had to go down and establish a benchmark of when somebody was born and to whom, and then go back 21 or 25 years later to say that they were now manumitted. There's gaps, and you don't know why. Did people die? Did they run away? Are they missing? Or more likely, did the slave masters decide they just weren't going to do that? Obviously the nature of slavery is people get taken advantage of. So it's really hard to make generalizations. It's a real mixed bag on this stuff.
Another one we got, well, first off, Eleanor's here, and her great-grandfather was James Crawford. So she's here in the chat with us here today.
Thanks, Eleanor.
And also, yes, this will be available on our website. We're going to post this once we clean it up and edit it just to make it look good. We'll be posting it to our website, which is posted in the chat. Another question for you, Rick, is do you know if New Jersey had a version of sharecropping after the Civil War?
So, interesting question. So, we always associate, in fact, we probably associate all of this stuff with stuff down south. But the example I gave of Charles and Hannah Reeves, in effect, they were sharecroppers. The real story is that house that they lived in was on what is now Christian Brothers Academy property that Crawford's owned. And so James Crawford, I believe, but it might have been George, I'm not sure which, had that house. They had rolled over the fields, literally, to where it finally wound up on what is now Middletown and Lincroft Road. But he didn't give it by deed, nor that property, to Charles and Hannah. They didn't get that property till 1900, right after Charles dies. James Crawford, I've got the copy of the deed, gives it to his son, James Reeves. So in effect, all those years, Charles was a sharecropper. He was working for the Crawfords. They gave him a house, and he was earning some amount of money, which I don't know. But I don't know how you could distinguish it from sharecropping. The family didn't own the house, for a good 50 years until they died.
So is there any evidence of fleeing slaves passing through or being sheltered in Monmouth County?
Great question. And I will tell you that over the years when I've spoken on this topic or just meeting people in various venues, occasionally someone will come up to me and say, hey, my grandmother's house had a root cellar and that's where the slaves hid. And I always say, I hope that's true, but you really need to have that documented, which is hard to do. Now, I'm sure that there were instances in Monmouth County where sympathetic abolitionists hid slaves until they could get them on the road to freedom. But I don't know of anything that's been documented. Certainly slaves from the South, as you already know, came up the Underground Railroad route. But, that's a generalization too. People went where they went. For instance, this Titus that I talked about, that I write in the book, is famously known as Colonel Ty when he went to fight for the British. He lived way down the end of the Rumson Peninsula, then Shrewsbury. And I think he just took a little boat across to Sandy Hook, where the British owned, and it was an island at the time. And that's the way he fled, as others could have. Now, there's also some indication that the Hartshorns, who lived in what we now know as Hartshorns Woods, right, in Middletown Highlands area, they were some of those Quaker Hartshorns were slaveholders, and some were abolition sympathizers as well. There's some indication that they may have sheltered some folks as they were trying to escape. So, it's all based on documentation. And it's some of that stuff is hard to come by because, let's face it, if you're helping people, you're not advertising it, and you're probably not going to write it down either. So that stuff will become revealed, I think, as families go through their archives, and I hope that they come to grips with it too.
So I also got, somebody was wondering about if there's documents to find out if somebody in colonial New Jersey owned slaves, like taxes or census records.
There absolutely is. I've got copies of a number of these. I've got 4 lists in 1771. And what New Jersey did in 1771 is we said, hey, we want a list. It's a tax list, basically, of all the things you own, including slaves. And I've got tax lists of Middletown and Shrewsbury and Stafford below us and Freehold out west of what were then the known slaves with their slave holders' names. But it's only numbers. So you'll see, a Grover with 2 slaves or a Hartshorn with 1. You're not going to know unless you have other supporting documents if there were, what the slaves' names were.
Mm-hmm.
There's a 1798 list too that's available, Middletown and Shrewsbury, showing those folks who owned slaves, but not the name. I am part of a project that is really exciting. It's now being called the Northeastern Slavery Records Index. And Dr. Walter Grayson, who wrote my foreword here from Monmouth University, and I are more or less the state directors on this. And what we're doing is we're gathering all the databases that have anything to do with slavery, slaveholders, slave ships, slaves, manumission records. And we're going to put them with, frankly, all the states in the northeast of New Jersey into this huge free online database so that people can not only research history, but also perhaps their relatives. And so what the multi-year project is going to eventuate to, I hope, is that where you see a slaveholder listed with 2 slaves, and then you have a document that years later, maybe he manumits somebody, and a little bit of genealogy, maybe you could put this together and find out a path of ancestry for people and other very interesting things. So the answer again is that yes, there are lists of slaves in New Jersey that I'm familiar with, and if anybody wants those, there's my email, rickg0817@yahoo. Send me an email, and I'll send you a copy of the list.
So Linda, his email's in there. That might be the way to contact. She was wondering if there's a link to the online databases. You could probably point her in the right direction.
I can.
And then another comment from David Treppold. Apparently, the Van Matter family owned 99 slaves on his farm, which was later sold to the founders of the North American phalanx.
Absolutely true. A friend of mine, I don't know if he's on today, Ron Bennett, is a descendant of the Van Matters. And like a lot of Dutch folks, not all, but a lot of Dutch folks in Monmouth County history, they were slaveholders. And some were and some weren't. But yes, that particular fellow owned quite a number. They appear somewhat on the slave list. Now, you got to understand something, as I'm sure you all do. Tax lists When the tax man comes knocking on your farmhouse door and says, how many slaves do you have? We're going to tax them. I don't know how honest you're going to be, you know, because there are people on that list that I know that have more than the 2 slaves that they list, because people don't want to pay taxes anyway. So you have to take some of those with a grain of salt, if you will. And then, of course, also, if you've got a list, even if you're honest in saying that, you know, you own the Hendricksons in Middletown, as an example, you own 4 slaves, let's say in 1771. Well, the month after that, 3 of those women have babies. So now you own 7. I mean, I don't know. So the lists are a starting point. They're not definitive.
Another comment was that there's another great book. Someone said Slavery and Freedom in the Rural North, African Americans in Monmouth County from 1665 to 1865 by Graham Russell Hodges. I don't know if you've mentioned.
I actually know Graham Russell Hodges. He's a wonderful scholar. He's up at Colgate. First time I actually met him, Stacy, was around the corner from your house. He was being filmed on the back porch of MJ's there, and I met him. He did, you know, visionary work, and I acknowledge him in the introduction here, because he started when he was a graduate student at NYU, coming down to the archives in Freehold, and did all of that work, of which that book is just one result, and he's really done a tremendous job. So Graham Hodges, and you can look up, he's got about 4 or 5 books concerning specific New Jersey history of African Americans, and well worth looking into.
Another person commented when you were talking about Trenton and the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, the African American Heritage Societies based in Trenton. Maybe you want to speak about that? She was saying.
Yeah, there's a group. It's actually Rider University, a group that have put together the Sons and Daughters of the Middle Passage. I've spoken at their conference, and I've got hopefully I'll speak again this year. You could look that up. It's a great group of folks that have, again, try to bring as much as they can to the fore about all these records. It gives them the opportunity to tell you more and more of this stuff is coming to light now as people come to grips with it. I will tell you that while I never in my life, as a somebody being educated in New Jersey, heard any of this, at the same time there were Black scholars and others writing about this that, for lack of a better word, never made it into mainstream. I've got 12 pages of bibliography of books that have been written. People like Larry Green up at Seton Hall and others that have unique perspective and have had for years. But what this kind of flooding of the marketplace of books like this is now doing is bringing people into various groups. People are going into their family archives and talking about what happened to them and what they know about this. And it's going to be more. There's going to be a more robust scholarship about this in the next bunch of years, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Another one, someone says, Rick, do you know anything about Black Bart, the abolitionist who lived in Red Bank?
Not enough, but who's ever saying that, if they want to tell us, I'd like to hear.
Yeah, for sure. So I can go back and figure out, but definitely that'd be something to hear more of. Another person mentioned, I got 2 more really. So someone mentioned in a future edition, maybe your book can include a reference to Samuel Johnson, the New Jersey slave that was lynched in Eatontown in 1886.
Yeah, Mingo Jack. Yeah, it's a horrendous story. I'm friends with a group of people that are going to put up maybe they already have, a stone to that horrible episode in New Jersey. And that gives me the opportunity to tell you that there was a lot more that I found out about that I could put in any one book. What I tried to do in this book was put in stories of both East and West Jersey, more or less by county, to give us a kind of an overview. But there's tons and tons more. And yes, that's exactly right. We had lynchings in New Jersey, as horrible as that is.
Mm-hmm. One more person had commented, if you can, curious to know more about the amount of enslaved people who were sold in the North into New Jersey from the Chesapeake area. It seems that the importation of servants was common, as New Jersey was a passed multiple tariffs for the importation of enslaved Africans as well as Native Americans through the 18th century. Archaeological excavation in Burlington County discovered red tobacco pipe like those in the Chesapeake region, as well as objects from West Africa, designs and organizations within the subfloor pit.
I'm glad to hear that. By the way, I mentioned Perth Amboy on the East Coast as a slave port and a slave auction site. On the western part of our state, turned out to be the same thing in Camden. When Philadelphia outlawed slave sales in the late 18th century, the slave auctioneers just moved across the river to what was then Cooper's Ferry, now Camden, and they just had slave auctions there. And slave ships were coming up the Delaware. But what really eventuated in New Jersey it wasn't direct importation after a while of slaves from Africa. And by the way, you should know, as far as scholars know, maybe about 12 to 14 million Africans were enslaved and brought to the New World. The vast majority into South America, notably Brazil. A lot of them were put into the Caribbean islands, and maybe, again, these are speculative numbers, but maybe 500,000 actually came up to the 13 original colonies. And over time, New Jersey slaves weren't Africa one day and 3 weeks later they show up in New Jersey. There were sales all around from different states, and people went and bought slaves where they could, and they came from a lot of different directions. And we see this in the laws too. As the laws get passed to restrict New Jersey citizens from buying slaves from other places, it becomes more difficult to do that. Quakers all over New Jersey, but especially in West Jersey, were very early, certainly by the mid 18th century, talking about abolition, and really led the fight for the rest of our state to come to grips with it. By the way, I want to spend a second, because I know people are going to have to do other things, to just say this is all nice to know stuff. It's great, and there's a lot more you can know. But the challenge that I have for myself and for all of us is, okay, we know this. What are we going to do with it? And it seems to me that the social justice movement today, among other things, has got to be based on the foundation of what we know, but what are we going to do? And there's plenty of groups out there, not just historic groups, like the T. Thomas Fortune House, for instance, in Red Bank, and the Red Bank Library that does Let's Talk About Race and these kinds of things, where we can, as citizens, take what we know and do something with it that is for the better good of our society. So I'll leave that to all of us to decide what to do, but I'd like to encourage that.
Yeah, so somebody had mentioned that you will be presenting on Wednesday, March 31st at 7 p.m. at the Red Bank Public Library. Let's Talk About Race. If you're interested in going to that, the registration is on the Red Bank Public Library website. And then our one last question, I guess, is just, were there a lot of New Jersey politicians who still owned slaves when the 1804 abolition law was passed?
So the operative word is a lot, and the answer is I don't know. I'm sure some of them did, and I'm sure the reason that those laws are gradual and painful is just because of that. Because, the powerful people in our state, or any state for that matter, and that's still true today, have influence in legislatures. And whether or not, and there were some, and I talk about them in the book, there were some legislature slave owners who were slaveholders. How many in any particular session of our Senate and Congress in New Jersey, I don't know. But it would probably surprise me that there were more than not. You really have to look into individuals. There's a famous story that I'll just give you the brief overview. At one point, when our government at the federal level was being formed, Thomas Jefferson, there's a million stories about him in slavery, but he was lobbying that there would not be slave states west of the Abolition, I should say the Abolition, sorry. And the day of the vote, the New Jersey representative, one of our legislators, was absent, And so that provision in an ordinance that we were passing never got put into place. And I talk about in the book how it would have, had it got passed where new states couldn't become slave states. It might have changed the course of our history and certainly maybe even the Civil War. So yeah, some of the legislators certainly were slaveholders, and their descendants and other powerful people opposed abolition because it was going to hurt them in their pocketbooks.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. It looks like there's another organization out there, if anyone's interested, not in our town, Princeton, who has monthly conversations and advocates for racial injustice. And the link is there in the chat. Another person said that when I was a Boy Scout back in the 70s, we visited a house in Middletown by the bay, maybe Leonardo, where there was a safe room for slaves escaping. I don't know if it's there anymore.
So that used to be called a spy house. It's not called that anymore because they don't think it was a spy house. And I don't know if they've ever documented that as a safe haven. If they have, I'm not aware of it.
Interesting. Well, Rick, I can't thank you enough for being here today. It's we've gone plenty long, and I appreciate you taking the time to tell us all this information about a painful and all too little known part of our local history. But so important to bring this all to the forefront. One other quick notice, we have our next virtual event's going to be organized by our local poetry group. They want to honor the life and work of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was a beat poet and involved in that movement in the 60s and recently passed away. So when the details are firmed up, we'll get the word out by email on that. But thank you for being here today. Thanks for all of you for coming. I really appreciate the attendance. We will have the recording available for those that missed. But thanks so much.
Thank you very much for having me. And anybody who wants to get a hold of me, please do. I'll be glad to help where I can. Have a great day. And spring is almost here.
Almost here.
Yes. Love it.
All right. See you all later.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.